Under the merciless sun of Arizona's Sand Valley in the summer of 1888, Elias Stone Blackwell rode with a slow, steady rhythm, dust lifting with every step of his gray Mustang. The cracked earth of this lonesome stretch near the Mexican border swallowed tracks as fast as they formed, leaving only whispers of his passage. The silence out here was sacred, broken only by the faint creak of leather, the whine of wind through mesquite, and the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk circling above. Elias liked it this way, alone, quiet, predictable. His broad shoulders, scarred from shrapnel in the Civil War, hunched slightly under a faded denim jacket. His face, weathered like the cliffs around him, bore a map of grief, deep lines etched around gray eyes that rarely met another's gaze. At 38, Elias was a man carved from stone, his heart a locked vault since the raid that took his wife, Clara, and their 6-year-old daughter, Rose, in '83. Every evening, he knelt by their nameless graves behind the ranch, whispering apologies to ghosts who never answered. If you're hooked on cowboy love stories like this, drop a 1 in the comments to join the Wild West Love Mysteries community. The air shimmered with heat as Elias trailed a stray mare, lost since dawn. His hands, calloused from years of rope and rifle, gripped the reins loosely. The Sand Valley, a 20-mile stretch of sagebrush and sandstone, was his refuge, a place where memories could fade into the dust. But then he heard it so faint, it might have been the wind, a sound like a breath that had forgotten how to breathe. He froze in his saddle, head tilting, heart slowing. It came again, a whimper, weak and sharp, like a thread about to snap. His pulse quickened, a rare crack in his stoic shell. Dismounting swiftly, he tied the reins to a gnarled juniper, his Winchester slung over his back. His boots crunched on gravel as he moved through scraggly brush and boulders, the air thick with the scent of baked earth and creosote. He reached a clearing at the edge of a sheer cliff, where an ancient cottonwood stood like a weary sentinel. There, bound to a massive sandstone slab, was a young woman, her body trussed in a cruel inversion, head tilted downward, feet lashed to the tree's roots above. Her arms, stretched taut by coarse hemp ropes, bore raw burns where the fibers bit into her wrists. Her sun-dark skin, dusted with sand, glistened with sweat. Her long black hair, matted with blood, hung like a tattered curtain. Her chest rose in shallow, erratic breaths, each one pushing her body closer to the cliff's edge. Right next to the rock, driven deep into the earth, was a crude wooden sign, scrawled with the words, "Don't mess with the white man." A mysterious, ominous symbol was carved onto her forehead, mark of a notorious criminal gang. Blood seeped from the ropes on her ankles, and each labored breath made her body sway more precariously over the cliff edge. A crude symbol, jagged and red, was carved into her forehead, a mark of the Blackthorn gang, notorious for their brutality in these parts. Elias stepped back, bile rising in his throat. The air thickened, a warning, a message, a curse. His hand went to the Bowie knife on his belt. "Jesus," he muttered, voice rough as gravel. "What the hell did they do to you?" Her head lolled slightly, eyes fluttering open-dark, frightened, unfocused. She was young, maybe 19, with a high brow and a strong jaw, her cheeks hollow from thirst. Dried blood crusted her cracked lips. Elias scanned the ridges, the rock snow movement. No sound, just the wind brushing dead leaves like whispers of ghosts. His fingers trembled as he approached, the weight of that symbol screaming at him, echoing sins he'd never committed, but felt guilty for all the same. "You hear me, girl?" he asked, voice hoarse. No response. "I ain't here to hurt you," he said softer, almost to himself. His boots crunched closer. The ropes were old mesquite fiber, knotted tight to make her suffer, not just die. Whoever did this meant for her to be a warning. He pulled his knife, its blade glinting in the noon sun. "Hold still," he said, though she barely stirred. The rope groaned as he sliced, each cut deliberate, his hand steady despite the storm in his chest. She fell forward, limp like a broken doll, and he caught her just in time, her body warm, burning even, and light as a child's in his arms. Her breath was a faint rattle, but she was alive. Elias eased her to the ground, kneeling in the dust. He pulled a canteen from his belt, soaked a bandana, and dabbed her cracked lips. "Easy now," he murmured. "You're safe for the moment." Her eyes flickered, locking onto his for a fleeting second, wild and wary, like a cornered doe. Her hand twitched, clutching weakly at his sleeve, then fell limp. "Got a name?" he asked gently, brushing a strand of hair from her face. No answer, just a shallow breath. "Reckon we'll find one for you," he muttered, his voice a low drawl, thick with the cadence of Arizona's borderlands. He draped his jacket over her shoulders, the denim swallowing her slight frame. Standing, he lifted her with effort, cradling her like something not yet broken. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the valley. His ranch, a modest spread of adobe and timber 3 miles west, waited under the creak of a lone windmill. He carried her to his horse, her head pressed to his chest, her breaths like dry leaves skittering across stone. And with that, Elias Stone Blackwell stepped back into the wilderness, carrying a girl marked for death and a secret heavy enough to hang a man. The ride back was slow, the Mustang's hooves kicking up red dust that clung to Elias's boots. Sand Valley stretched around them, a sea of sagebrush and silence, broken only by the occasional howl of a coyote. At the ranch, he eased her down, carrying her inside to a cot in the single-room house. The walls, patched with sheet metal, glowed faintly in the lantern light. Her eyes fluttered open dark, wide, distant, but they watched him, wary as ever. He set a basin of water by her feet, dipping a cloth to clean the blood and dust from her skin. His movements were gentle, reverent, like tending a sacred relic. She flinched at his touch, just barely, and he paused, waiting. When she didn't pull away, he continued, careful not to meet her gaze too long, though he felt her eyes on him, sharp as a half-drawn blade. "You're safe here," he said, breaking the silence. "Just cleaning up a bit." No reply, but her lips parted, a breath escaping. "Reckon you don't talk much," he muttered, not unkindly. "That's all right. Silence is better than most things round here." He wrapped her wrists in soft cloth, the burns red and angry against her skin. "Remind me of a river I saw once, down near the Gila," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Looked dry, dead even, but after a storm, it ran deep and fierce. Had a Navajo name, Alara, they called it. Quiet but strong." He glanced at her, her features sharp in the lamplight cheekbones like ridgelines, lashes thick with sand. "I'll call you Kaylin for now. Suits you." She blinked slowly. No protest, just breath. Elias stood, tucking a blanket around her. He grabbed his bedroll, heading for the barn to give her space. The night was still, stars blinking like ghosts waking up. Inside, she dreamed of fire, of ropes cutting skyward, of hands rough but gentle, washing the hurt away without asking anything in return. The days in Sand Valley, Arizona, in that sweltering summer of 1888, unfolded with the slow, relentless rhythm of desert life, where time seemed to hang heavy like the heat that shimmered over the sagebrush and sandstone cliffs stretching across the 20-mile expanse. Elias Stone Blackwell moved through his chores with the same quiet precision he'd honed in the war, his broad hands mending fences, brushing down the Mustangs, or hauling water from the creaking windmill that groaned like an old man's lament under the relentless sun. His ranch, a patchwork of adobe walls and weathered timber 3 miles from the Mexican border, stood as a stubborn outpost against the vast emptiness, its shadows long and lean in the dawn light. Kaylin, as he'd named her, remained a silent presence in the single-room house, her slight frame curled on the cot, her dark eyes tracking his every move with the wariness of a hawk perched on a high ridge. Her sun-dark skin, still marred by bruises and the raw burns on her wrists, bore the weight of unspoken horrors, and the jagged red symbol carved into her forehead, a cruel brand from the Blackthorn gang, seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a silent accusation that thickened the air between them. Elias, his own scars hidden beneath his denim shirt, felt the weight of her gaze like a stone in his chest, stirring memories of loss he'd buried deep since that blood-soaked night in '83, when raiders left his wife and daughter as ashes in the wind. Each morning, Elias set a tin plate of cornbread and a cup of water near her cot, careful not to crowd her, his movements deliberate, like a man taming a wild colt with patience rather than force. He spoke to her in low, steady tones, his voice carrying the rough drawl of Arizona's borderlands, telling stories of the mustangs he raised, how the gray mare, Sable, could outrun a storm, or how the valley's red cliffs glowed like embers at dusk. Kaylin ate sparingly, her thin fingers trembling as they broke the bread, her lips cracked but no longer bleeding, her high cheekbones casting sharp shadows in the lantern light. Her silence was a fortress, unyielding, but Elias noticed subtle shifts. Her shoulders, once rigid as iron, softened slightly when he spoke. Her eyes, once wild with fear, lingered on him with a flicker of curiosity, like a desert spring catching the first light after a long drought. "Ain't much for talkin', are you?" he said one evening, leaning against the doorframe, his gray eyes catching hers for a moment before dropping to the floor. "That's fine. Words don't always mean truth out here." She blinked, her lashes thick with dust, and though she didn't speak, her gaze held his heartbeat longer, as if testing the weight of his kindness. One night, a thunderstorm rolled in from the south, its growl echoing across Sand Valley like a warning from the heavens, the wind howling through the mesquite and rattling the sheet metal roof. Kaylin stirred on the cot, her breath sharp and ragged, her body curling tight as if shielding itself from unseen blows. Elias, sitting by the fire, his hands idle for once, heard her mutter fragmented words in Navajo, jagged like broken glass. Fire, cold eyes, gold. Her voice cracked, a dry riverbed splitting open, and her hands clawed at the blanket. He crossed the room, his boots heavy on the creaking floorboards, and knelt beside her, his calloused hand hovering, unsure, before resting lightly on her shoulder. "Easy, Kaylin," he murmured, his voice soft as the rain now drumming the roof. "Ain't no fire here, just a storm passing through." Her eyes snapped open, dark and wide, unfocused, like a deer caught in a hunter's sights. She gasped, her chest heaving, and for a moment she spoke in a rush, her words tumbling like stones down a cliff. "They burned it, my mother. My brother. Man with eyes like steel. Gold in the earth." Her voice broke, and she curled tighter, her body trembling like a leaf in the gale. Elias sat back, his jaw tight, his own ghosts. Staringa night 5 years past when flames swallowed his home. Clara's screams fading into silence, Rose's tiny hand cold in his. He swallowed hard, the ache in his chest sharp as a blade. "I know that kind of hurt," he said, his voice low, barely audible over the storm. "Lost my family to raiders. Came back too late. Couldn't do nothing but bury 'em." He paused, his fingers tracing the edge of the cot. "Whatever you saw, Kaylin, it ain't your fault. Men like that, they burn what they can't take." Her trembling slowed, her eyes locking onto his, no longer wild but searching, as if his words had carved a narrow path through her fear. She didn't speak, but her hand unclenched, resting open on the blanket, a small surrender to the moment. With a slow death intended for her and her hunters still lurking, 4 mornings later, Elias spotted a fresh boot print, smaller than his, sharp in the dirt near the corral, its cavalry heel gleaming with menace. He crouched, eyes sweeping the sagebrush-dotted ridges, seeing only heat shimmer, while inside, Kaylin sat by the window, her sun-dark frame rigid, her dark eyes fixed on the horizon, silent as a desert grave, her star-shaped scar a quiet warning of the danger still stalking her. Days later, at dawn, the valley lay still, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and sage. Elias was splitting wood near the barn when hoofbeats broke the silence. 3 riders, dust curling behind them like a serpent's tail. The leader, Captain Garrett, a young officer in a crisp blue uniform, reined in his horse, his face sharp with purpose but softened by a flicker of doubt. "Elias Blackwell?" he called, his voice clipped. "Military. We're looking for a Navajo girl, wanted for murder and theft. Seen her." Elias set his axe down, his stance easy but his eyes hard as flint. He'd heard rumors of a massacre up near the Blackthorn mines, whispers of gold and blood, but he'd never trusted soldiers' justice. "Ain't seen no one but coyotes and my horses," he said, his drawl slow, deliberate. Garrett's gaze narrowed, scanning the ranch, while two rough-looking miners behind him, Blackthorn's men, no doubt shifted in their saddles, hands near their revolvers. "You sure?" Garrett pressed, leaning forward. "She's dangerous. Killed a man, stole from the mines." Elias's jaw tightened, the lie bitter on his tongue but steady as stone. "If I see her, I'll send word. Ain't no trouble here." The riders left, their dust fading into the horizon, but the air hung brittle, like glass about to shatter. Inside, Kaylin stood by the window, her slight frame wrapped in Elias's old coat, her eyes fixed on the retreating figures. She hadn't spoken, but her shoulders were tense, her fingers knotted in the fabric. "They're gone," Elias said, stepping inside, his hat in hand. "But they'll be back." Her gaze met his, not fearful now but sharp, like a blade half-drawn, questioning his choice. "Why'd you lie?" she whispered, her voice dry as the valley's earth, the first words she'd spoken to him directly. Elias looked at her, his heart heavy and alive, the weight of his own past mingling with hers. "Out here, truth ain't always what men in uniform say it is," he said. "You're safe with me, Kaylin. That's my choice." She held his gaze, her eyes softening, and in that moment, trust cracked the silence just a little wider, like a seed breaking through parched ground, hinting at something deeper yet to grow. The stars burned cold above Sand Valley, Arizona, in the waning days of August 1888, their light sharp and unyielding, like the glint of a rifle barrel trained on the heart of the desert night, where shadows clung to the jagged cliffs and mesquite groves, stretched like skeletal fingers across the moonlit expanse. Elias Stone Blackwell stood on the porch of his adobe ranch, 3 miles from the Mexican border, his broad frame taut, his gray eyes scanning the horizon where the dust of Captain Garrett's riders had faded that morning, leaving behind a silence heavier than the heat that lingered in the cracked earth. Kaylin, the Navajo girl he'd named, stood just inside the door, her slight figure draped in his oversized coat, her sun-dark hands clutching the fabric, her high cheekbones catching the flicker of lantern light that danced like a restless spirit across the room's rough walls. The raw burns on her wrists, though bandaged, seemed to pulse with the memory of her torment, and the jagged red symbol on her forehead, a cruel brand from the blackthorn, gleamed faintly, as if it held secrets too dangerous to speak. Elias felt her presence like a weight on his soul, her quiet strength stirring something in him, he thought, long buried since the ashes of '83. When his wife and daughter burned in a raid that left his heart a scorched ruin. The air was thick with unspoken promises, and he knew, as the wind carried the faint howl of a coyote across the 20-mile valley, that time was running out. Inside, by the fire's dying embers, Elias packed a saddlebag with jerky, a canteen, and a spare knife, his movements precise but heavy with purpose, like a man carving his own epitaph. Kaylin watched, her dark eyes no longer wild but steady, like a river finding its course after a storm. And when he glanced at her, she spoke, her voice low and cracked, carrying the cadence of her Navajo tongue beneath the English she'd learned from traders. "They'll come back," she said, her words a blade slicing through the silence. "They always do." Elias paused, his calloused hand tightening on the leather strap. "Then we won't be here when they do," he replied, his Arizona drawl steady but laced with iron. "There's land south of the border, in the Sierra Madres, where your people might still be free. We ride tonight." Her gaze held his, searching, and then she stepped closer, her bare feet whispering on the floorboards, her breath catching as she spoke. "My name's not Kaylin," she said, her voice trembling like a leaf in a gale. "It's Ilaramian starlight in my tongue. I saw what they did, Elias. The man with steel eyes, Blackwood, he burned our camp for gold, killed my kin, left me as a warning." Her fingers brushed the scar on her forehead, and her eyes burned with fury and grief, a fire that could outshine the stars. Ilara's voice trembled, her sun-dark hands clutching the blanket, as she spoke of her grandmother, a century old, pressing her ear to the desert earth, Hearing the enemy's approach, she stacked stones in a wolf shape, signaling an ambush, Ilara said, her eyes distant, reflecting Sand Valley's starlit cliffs. The chief lit 3 smoke columns, warning of danger. Most villagers fled, but grandmother told us we'd fight to the last breath for our land. Elias's chest tightened, her words cutting deeper than any blade, echoing his own ghosts of loss and guilt. Ilara's hands fell to her lap, her slender frame trembling, silent at first, like a desert trembling before a storm. Then raw, jagged sobs broke free, her body curling inward, arms clutching her knees, her dark braid a veil shielding her anguish. The grief, too vast for her slight form, spilled out in shuddering waves, echoing Sand Valley's wind. Elias sat still, his gray eyes steady, offering no hollow words. Instead, he pressed his calloused hand into the dust beside her woven star, fingers splayed, a quiet vow of presence. Not touch, but a shared scar in the desert's heart. He nodded, his jaw set like the cliffs that guarded the valley. Ilara, he repeated, tasting the name like a prayer. We'll make it through this, you and me. Her lips parted, no sound at first, then a whisper. Why risk your life for mine? He looked at her, his gray eyes soft but unyielding, like stone worn smooth by a river. 'Cause I've seen enough blood spilled for nothing, he said. You're worth more than their lies. Her hand reached out, hesitating, then touched his arm, her fingers light but firm, a silent vow that bound them in the flickering light. Ilara's dark eyes searched Elias's face, her voice a whisper like Sand Valley's wind. Why save me, a Navajo? Elias paused, his gray eyes heavy with ghosts. I came home to embers once my wife, my girl, gone. I froze, too weak to fight the flames. He stepped closer, his calloused hand cupping her cheek, gentle as starlight. I don't love skin, Ilara, I love the fire beneath. Her breath caught, eyes glistening. She pressed her face into his palm. Their kiss, tentative then deep, bloomed like desert rain, shadows merging on the adobe wall, a quiet vow sealed. We got a ride, Elias said, securing the last strap on his saddlebag, his voice low as Sand Valley's dusk. Ilara nodded, her dark eyes steady, already sensing the urgency. South, past the border, he continued, his Arizona drawl firm like the cliffs around them. In the Sierra Madres they say Navajos still roam free, far from soldiers, far from scars. He paused, his calloused hand brushing hers, a silent vow. We'll make it if we ride hard. Ilara drew near, her sun-dark cheeks faintly flushed under the Sand Valley starlight, her slender fingers clasping Elias's calloused hand with quiet strength. His gray eyes, heavy with scars, met hers, his voice a low desert murmur. You'll ride with me? Her forehead pressed against his chest, her breath warm through his worn denim, a lifeline in the vast night. I want to live, she said, her Navajo cadence slow, deliberate, as your wife. Her words, like a river breaking through stone, bound them, their shadows merging on the canyon wall, a vow etched in starlight. Her star-marked forehead gleamed, her resolve aflame in the desert night, binding them to a shared horizon. By midnight, they were saddled, Elias on his gray Mustang, Sable, and Ilara on a bay mare, her frame small but resolute, her braids swaying like a dark river as they rode into the desert under a sky studded with stars like scattered diamonds. The trail south was treacherous, winding through canyons where the walls loomed like silent judges, the air thick with the scent of creosote and danger, the silence broken only by the clatter of hooves on stone and the distant wail of wind through the mesquite. Elias rode ahead, his Winchester across his lap, his senses sharp as a hawk's, every shadow a threat in the moonlight that painted the valley silver. Ilara followed, her posture tense but steady, her hands gripping the reins with a strength that belied her fragile frame, her eyes scanning the ridges as if she could see the ghosts of her past lurking there. Dawn was still hours away when the first shot cracked through the night, a sharp echo that splintered the silence like glass, and Elias lurched in his saddle, a bullet grazing his shoulder, blood blooming dark against his shirt. "Elara, ride!" he shouted, his voice raw, but she wheeled her horse around, her face fierce, her eyes blazing like a storm-lit sky. "No!" she cried, her voice a thunderclap, as another shot whizzed past, striking the rock behind them. From the ridge, 3 figures emerged, Blackthorn's miners, their rifles glinting, their faces shadowed but their intent clear as death. Elias slumped, his vision blurring, but Elara dismounted, her movements swift and feral, like a mountain lion cornered but unbowed. She dragged him behind a boulder, her hands trembling but sure as she tore a strip from her skirt to bind his wound, her breath hot and quick against his cheek. "Stay with me," she hissed, her voice a mix of fear and fury, her fingers slick with his blood as she pressed the cloth tight, her dark braid falling over her shoulder like a lifeline. Elias grunted, pain searing through him, but her touch grounded him, her strength, a fire that burned brighter than his fading strength. He gazed up at Elara, pain and awe in his eyes. "You said you'd be my wife." She knelt, cradling his face. "I meant it." A faint smile broke through his pain. "Then we'd better survive this pass." She nodded, and for the first time since they met, Lena prayed not to the settlers' gods, but to the spirits of fire, wind, and survival. Love here was a reckless bet, and tonight they staked everything. The tent flaps stirred in the river breeze, moonlight threading through the seams like silver. "You're too damn stubborn to die," she said, a faint smile breaking through her fear. And he managed a weak chuckle, his hand gripping hers. "Reckon you're right," he rasped, "but we gotta move." They stumbled into a narrow canyon, Elara half carrying him, her slight frame straining under his weight, her resolve a beacon in the dark as bullets chipped the rocks behind them. The riders hesitated, unwilling to follow into the tight pass, and the shots faded into the night. In the shadow of the canyon walls, Elias sank to his knees, blood dripping onto the dust, his breath ragged but his eyes locked on hers, pain and wonder mingling like stars in a storm. "You didn't run," he said, his voice a low scrape. "Meant what I said," she replied, kneeling beside him, her hand cupping his face, her touch warm against his cooling skin. "I'm Elara, and I fight for what's mine." Lem. Hours later, as they hid in a shallow cave, the air cool and heavy with the scent of damp stone, a new sound broke the silence. Hoofbeats, slow and deliberate. Elias tensed, his hand on his knife, but Elara's eyes widened, not with fear but recognition. Captain Garrett emerged, alone, his uniform dusty, his face no longer sharp with duty, but softened by doubt. "I heard 'em talkin'," he said, his voice low, urgent. "Blackwood's men there coverin' up a massacre. I'm not here to take you, Elara. I'm here to help." Her gaze flickered to Elias, questioning, but his nod was steady, a silent trust forged in the crucible of their flight. The desert held its breath, and in that moment, their bond forged in blood, fire, and defiance, became a vow to face the truth together, no matter the cost. The dawn broke over Sand Valley, Arizona, in late August 1888, casting a golden glow across the mesquite groves and sandstone cliffs, the light soft and warm, like a promise of redemption woven into the desert's heart. The air, once thick with the threat of violence, now carried the sweet scent of sage and the gentle murmur of a river winding through the valley. Elias Stone Blackwell leaned against the smooth stone of a shallow cave, his shoulder bandaged, the wound beneath no longer bleeding but mending, a quiet testament to his survival. His gray eyes, etched with the scars of war and the loss of his family in '83, softened as they traced the horizon where the dust of their pursuers had faded into the night. Beside him, Elara knelt, her sun-dark skin glowing in the morning light, her slender fingers adjusting the cloth around his wound with gentle care, her dark braids swaying like a river's current. The jagged red scar on her forehead, once a cruel brand of the Blackthorn gang, caught the dawn's light, now a symbol of her resilience. Captain Garrett, his blue uniform faded but his young face alight with quiet resolve, stood at the cave's mouth, his Colt revolver holstered, his posture eased by the fragile trust that bound the trio together. The night before had been a storm of desperation. Bullets had torn through the darkness as Elias, Elira, and Garrett fled south toward the Sierra Madres, the Blackthorn gang's hooves thundering behind them. Elias's shoulder had bled through his denim shirt, each breath a struggle against pain. But his focus remained on Elara, her quiet strength a beacon that kept him moving. Elara, riding her bay mare, moved with a grace that belied her exhaustion, her eyes scanning the ridges for danger, her resolve a flame no wind could extinguish. Garrett, once a loyal soldier to Thongdok Blackwood, had turned renegade, carrying ledgers that proved Blackwood's massacre of Navajo families and theft of their gold. They'd found refuge in the cave, a narrow pass between cliffs shielding them as the riders faltered, unwilling to risk the treacherous rocks. In the stillness, Elias had looked at Elara, his heart stirred by her fire, her spirit like the mustangs he'd tamed, wild, unyielding, but capable of trust. "You ready for this?" he'd asked, his Arizona drawl soft as the desert breeze. "I've run long enough," she'd replied, her voice carrying the cadence of Navajo prayers. "Blackwood took my family. I'll take his lies." Garrett stepped closer, pulling the crumpled ledgers from his coat. "Your word in court, Elara. With this it'll end him." The journey to Dust Hollow was a quiet ride under a sun that warmed rather than judged. Elias rode Sable, his gray Mustang, his wounded shoulder stiff, but his grip steady, his face softened by the woman beside him. Elara, her braid bouncing against her back, rode with a calm resolve, her eyes no longer searching for danger, but drinking in the valley's beauty sagebrush and sandstone cliffs, standing as silent witnesses to their survival. Garrett led the way, his uniform, a faded symbol of authority, now turned to justice, his jaw set with purpose. In Dust Hollow, the courthouse stood like a weathered altar, its wooden steps creaking under the boots of townsfolk gathered for the trial, their whispers soft, curious rather than bloodthirsty. Blackwood, tall and imposing in a tailored suit, his steel-gray eyes cold, stood at the defendant's table, his voice smooth but venomous as he denied the charges, his lies polished as the stolen gold. Elara stepped into the courtroom, her frame small but unbowed, the scar on her forehead a stark accusation that hushed the crowd. Elias stood behind her, his presence a shield, his gray eyes burning with quiet fury, his calloused hand brushing hers in a touch that spoke of trust deeper than the valley's canyons. "Tell him, Elara," he murmured, his voice a low rumble, like thunder softened by distance. She faced Blackwood, her voice steady, each word a stone hurled at his empire of lies. "He burned our camp, killed my mother, my brother. For gold he tore from our land. I saw it, and he marked me to die." The crowd stirred. Blackwood's face twitched, but Elara stood firm, her strength a river breaking through stone. Garrett presented the ledgers, his voice clear, cutting through the murmurs, and the judge, his face like weathered leather, leaned forward, his gavel poised like fate. The trial was a storm, Blackwood's men shouting threats, but Elara's testimony, backed by Garrett's evidence, was a blade that cut through the chaos. When the gavel fell, Blackwood was led away in chains, his empire crumbling like sand in the wind. Outside, the sun dipped low, casting Dust Hollow in a crimson glow. Elara stumbled, her body trembling with the weight of victory, her eyes wet but unyielding. Elias caught her, his arms steady, his touch gentle as he traced the scar on her forehead. "This ain't shame," he said, his voice soft but firm. "It's proof you survived." Later at their ranch, he etched a small tattoo over the Scara star, delicate and fierce, a symbol of her Navajo spirit. Her fingers brushed his as he worked, their eyes meeting, a quiet understanding that their scars had forged them into one. Months passed on the southern edge of the territory, where the border blurred into mesquite groves and dry winds carried scents of sage. A small lodge stood near the river's bend, made of pine and hide, strong but humble, surrounded by whispering reeds and wildflowers. Inside, Elias lay propped on folded blankets, his breath slow but strong, the fever from his wound long past. Elara sat beside him, a basin of cool water at her side, gently wiping his brow. Crickets sang low outside, and the water whispered over stone. He watched her through half-lidded eyes, the corners of his mouth lifting. "You always this bossy with your patients?" he murmured. She raised an eyebrow, smiling. "Only the ones too stubborn to die." He chuckled, then winced as the laughter tugged at his stitches. She hushed him, her palm over his chest, steadying him. The silence deepened, not awkward but full, like the valley itself. "Tell me something true," Elias said, his voice softer, raw. "What's your real name?" She hesitated, then guided his hand to her chest, over her heart. "Elara," she said. "It means starlight. My mother gave it to me." Elias closed his eyes, letting the name settle like a prayer. When he opened them, warmth shone through his weariness. "Elara," he repeated, tasting the word. "You're the only peace I've ever known." She held his hand tighter, her eyes glistening but steady. The ranch became a sanctuary, its walls adorned with drying herbs and woven blankets, the creaking windmill singing a soft song. Elara, her belly gently rounded beneath a woven sash, sat cross-legged under the lodge's awning, stitching a tiny white shirt, her fingers sure as she hummed a lullaby that hushed even the distant coyotes. Elias, now stronger, trained a young Mustang in the corral, his low commands patient and firm, his eyes often drifting to Elara's silhouette through the light curtain, a smile warming his weathered face. The lodge bore no trophies, just bundles of herbs, 2 books, and a child's blanket waiting to be finished. Elara moved through it like the breath of the place, grounding and full of quiet life. One evening, Elara walked to the river, her bare feet kissing the cool water, her braid loose and flowing. She laid both hands over her belly. "Little one," she whispered, "your father didn't just survive, he loved, and he kept his promise." Elias's footsteps padded across the grass, and he stood beside her, their fingers entwining without a word. Together, they watched the river drift under the dusk, stars blinking into view. No one had expected 2 hunted souls to find this a quiet patch of earth where love took root. Not the kind written in history books, but the kind that endured. The river flowed, peaceful, like her name, like their life, like something truly home.